Rachel Maddow just uncovered a major Trump scandal that almost everyone overlooked. And trust me, this is way bigger than you might think at first. Stick around till the end to get the full story.
Donald Trump announced who he was going to run with for this past election. It was about 6 months ago that we got J.D. Vance announced as Trump's vice presidential running mate. His record as a public official, or even just his record kind of as an adult, was hard to explain. For most of his adult life, he had been basically a protege, realistically more like an intern, for years and years and years, for one very eccentric, very right-wing, German-born tech billionaire. That particular eccentric billionaire had basically adopted J.D. Vance, had set him up in a whole series of jobs, none of which he had very much success at. But then the billionaire decided that the next job he wanted to put J.D. Vance into was the United States Senate. And so he essentially bought a Senate campaign for him. He made the largest single political donation ever made to a U.S. Senate candidate in American history. And he effectively ran his campaign. And that is how J.D. Vance was effectively given the only job he ever had in politics before he then immediately became vice president of the United States. And, you know, at that point, when he was chosen to be Trump's running mate, you could basically not see him for all the red flags around him. You couldn't make him out amid all the red flags. I mean, the billionaire who gave him all of his jobs and installed him in the U.S. Senate, and who then reportedly told Trump to put him on the ticket with him as his vice presidential running mate, that billionaire himself is on the record saying he does not believe in democracy. He does not believe that women should have the right to vote in America. He once spent a small chunk of his huge fortune trying to get people to move onto floating sea colonies made from shipping containers, because that would be a better way to live than living in countries, because countries are so terrible and so is democracy, right? So that's the political project of the guy whose other political project was putting J.D. Vance in at the top of the U.S. government. So red flag. This is how the guy talks. This is how he was auditioning to be chosen as Trump's vice president.
Almost the thing that you need to do, step one in the process, is to totally replace, like rip out like a tumor, the current American leadership class, and then reinstall some sense of American, political religion.
Rip it out like a tumor. Rip it out like a tumor, he said. Whatever it is we've had in this country, rip it out like a tumor. So this is very bad news, right? When J.D. Vance would do podcast interviews and talk about how the government should, conservatives should see the government and government should seize the endowments of private universities, with conservatives in control, they should find ways to hurt even private companies that don't support the leader. He said we should rip out the current class of Americans like they're a tumor. Right? When he talked about all these things in these very radical right podcasts, he'd get his interlocutors very excited, these guys who he was talking to. And very frequently, they'd want to know more. They'd try to get him to talk about where it was that he got all these great ideas.
How do we, aside from elections, how do we rip out this leadership class? So these institutions are corrupted and rotted to the core. This elite ideology is everywhere and in all the things. What other options do we have besides voting them out, which we're seeing is ineffectual?
Yeah, so again, this is like a tough question, but this is maybe the question that confronts us right now, right? So there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
There's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things. Donald Trump had to get rid of his first-term vice president because his first-term vice president wouldn't help with his effort to overthrow the government and stay in power despite losing an election. And so Trump sicked a violent, angry mob on Capitol Hill, and that angry mob then proceeded to try to hunt down Trump's vice president, screaming that they wanted to kill him, hang Mike Pence. So that didn't go great. He needed a new guy. For the new guy, he picked this rando who had only been in the Senate about 5 minutes, who nobody in the country had really heard of, who had no political skills to speak of, who was deeply unpopular from the first moment he was named, but he was really, 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 really linked in to an eccentric, very far-right tech billionaire political faction. And the political guru of that political faction, the guy who inspires all of their political goals, is this one guy.
You know, there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
Knowing chuckle from the podcast interviewer. Oh, yeah, Curtis Yarvin. This guy, Curtis Yarvin, that's who J.D. Vance cites as the guy who's been doing the big thinking about this stuff.
Breaking down the J.D. Vance controversy. Rachel Maddow just shed light on a major political controversy surrounding J.D. Vance, Trump's VP pick and the billionaire who propelled him into power. Let's break this down. 1. J.D. Vance's sudden rise to power. Just 6 months ago, Trump announced J.D. Vance as his VP pick. Vance had little political experience. His only real job in politics was a Senate seat that was essentially handed to him. His career was shaped entirely by a single, eccentric, right-wing tech billionaire. 2. The billionaire behind the scenes. This billionaire, who was born in Germany, financially backed Vance's Senate campaign with the largest single donation in U.S. history. He placed Vance in a series of jobs, none of which he was particularly successful at. He reportedly urged Trump to select Vance as his VP. 3. The red flags around J.D. Vance. This billionaire doesn't believe in democracy or women's voting rights. He once pushed a bizarre idea of people living on floating sea colonies made of shipping containers because he thought countries and democracy itself were flawed. The same billionaire's political project was getting J.D. Vance into high government positions. 4. J.D. Vance's extreme views. He openly talks about ripping out America's leadership class like a tumor and replacing it. He believes in using government power to punish private companies that don't align with conservative ideology. He has suggested seizing the endowments of private universities to serve conservative goals. 5. Why this matters. Vance's rhetoric isn't just controversial, it's anti-democratic and authoritarian in nature. His billionaire backer's influence raises serious concerns about who is really shaping U.S. politics behind the scenes. His radical ideology could have major consequences for the future of American governance. Final thoughts. J.D. Vance's selection as Trump's VP isn't just another political move. It's part of a larger shift toward billionaire-backed, extremist politics. If the people funding and guiding him don't even believe in democracy, what does that mean for America's future?